This is Bartholomewtown. I'm Bill Bartholomew.
Bartholomewtown.
Earlier this week, I had the honor of hosting a live podcast at Johnson & Wales University as part of their Cultural Life series. The episode, Preserving the Past, Culture, Power, and the Stories That Shape a Nation, focused on Rhode Island's role as the United States approaches its 250th anniversary. I was joined by C. Morgan Grefe. She's the executive director of the Rhode Island Historical Society, and really a Rhode Island and beyond treasure. This conversation began as I asked Dr. Grefe a pretty basic question. As we start to assess history, Rhode Island or otherwise, how is it that historians make the determination what counts as an official document, an officially vetted source towards building the historic record? This is Bartholomewtown, live at Johnson & Wales University.
What we have throughout Rhode Island, throughout America, are also incredible institutions that collect history. That are repositories for myriad stories over time. Some of them are very broad collections. Some of them are very focused local or specific collections. And so for each one of these institutions, they think about building history in a different way. And so for the Rhode Island Historical Society, we're a little over 200 years old. We were founded very self-consciously at the 50th anniversary of the Gaspee, the burning of the Gaspee. And as they saw the records of many of the revolutionary generation, but also of Roger Williams and the colonial founders being destroyed, being thrown out, and losing them in fires and floods. And so there was a very self-conscious and concerted effort to collect and preserve those stories in particular that were written on paper. And that's how many of these institutions began. We're the fourth oldest in the country. And many of them started as paper-based, but also then went on to collect objects, to collect other types of material, all with the sake of making sure that it's not forgotten, but also with an educational mission from the outset, which is to use this material to make it accessible to others so that we can understand that story, so that we can understand the choices and actions that individuals made in these different, very tumultuous times. And for many of the folks who were the founders, it was just 50 years earlier. So some of them were directly involved in the revolution, and they certainly had family that was. And so this is not dissimilar from those of us today collecting things related to time frame of the bicentennial right now. And so thinking about the 1970s and the 1980s. So for those of us who lived through that, it seems like it just happened. And so I think we then build this concept of history and our history around that. Other local organizations might have much more specific charges. It might be a church that has collected their very specific records. It might be a town or a city that has their things that are important to them, or it might be an ethnic group that has particular cultural items and cultural patrimony that they want to make sure that they maintain. And so for all of us, it's about trying to find what we think will reinforce to those within the community what their story is and what those important and salient things are at the moment of collection. And also then what communicates out to others about what it is they should know about this community. And then we lose control of it, right? Because then it becomes whoever is looking at it, whoever is interrogating that history is now bringing their perspective and their lens, and they're able to, at one hand, become part of that story, and on the other hand, interpret it in new and different ways.
So well distilled, I think, right there. And it's so important to understand that fundamentally when we talk about history of any sort, whether it's what happened yesterday afternoon or 500 years ago, whatever the case may be, that there is at some level interpretation. So I think there's a responsible interpretation and there's an irresponsible interpretation, right?
Well, I think that there is interpretation and then there's opinions, and those are different things, right? So when we think about history as an academic discipline, or we think of history as a field, That's when we use that phrase, we're talking about the process of analysis of these materials. So, and the development of an argument that is supported and undergirded by agreed upon facts of what happened, a shared sense of what those things are that can then be interrogated by other scholars to make sure that your argument is logically and reasonably argued, right? Doesn't mean everybody agrees. Historians love disagreeing with each other. They disagree at fundamental levels. They disagree at very specific, minute levels. They love arguing with each other because what they do is argue. They put different documents, periods, things in conversation with each other. And then, but they have to have a shared basis and a basis in evidence, right? That's very different from an opinion of, I heard this thing happened and I don't like it, or I bet this is what happened. That's an opinion. That's not history.
Right. That's the fundamental lens that we're framing this discussion with. And it's also a question that we're asking, who gets to decide what that lens is going to be? Who gets to decide which primary documents or sources are advanced 200 years ago and in 200 years, right? That's always a question as well. But taking that lens, as you just put it, and putting it into the context of Rhode Island history, do we have a good sense of, a pretty well agreed upon sense of what happened from the time that, I don't know, let's say early 1600s onward? Do we know that pretty well where we can definitively say, here's what happened?
I think we know contours of it. I think we'll never know the day-to-day experience of what happened, except for those small snapshots that have been able to be saved. What we have is quite scant from this time period in terms of the written record. And that's just talking about the kind of traditional ways in which we might be collecting in sort of the Western idea of how we collect history and preserve it. So who's writing things down? Who has access to paper? Who has access to the time to keep a record? And then who has the stability in an area, in a community where that thing can be saved over time? So there are a lot of incredible factors that are outside of people's hands in many regards for how something lasts for 200, 300 years. Some of it is just luck in terms of what survives. So we have to be very careful about what we look at and say, well, we know this for sure, because what we have one example of something. We have one example of something. One example of something is not enough to make a definitive statement, except that's what happened to that person and how they perceived it, right? So we need to look and dive into different types of stories, different areas, different colonies to try to get other voices. And we also have the privilege and opportunity to work with our Native nations and our indigenous communities with the records and the traditions that they have of the stories to complicate those narratives, to give us different perspectives, and to make us think more broadly about the world in which people are acting. Because in that 1630s, right, Roger Williams and the people around him are entering into flourishing, fully functional societies here. And so we need to understand that broader picture. But it's very hard to get at. It is not like, I mean, we are in terms of the written record, this is not an area, this is not England. This is not where we have people who are keeping records. Our formal court system is still growing and burgeoning. We don't have the kinds of records because we're also having to send things to England, wait for things to come back. What makes that journey and what doesn't, let alone what gets saved, we're very fortunate to have the amount of things we do have in, say, the Providence-town papers, really extraordinary documents. But it does just give us a glimpse into that moment.
Yeah. It's so interesting you mentioned that there were several thriving nations in the area that we now know as Rhode Island. And a lot of people might not know that. They might think, oh, down in Charlestown, the Narragansett tribe existed. When in fact, this was a flourishing, you take a look at Mashpog Pond, for example, on the Cranston-Providence border, that was an epicenter of society, indigenous society. A lot of people don't realize that Providence on the whole, it was already an existing nation.
Yes.
How do we measure the impact of Roger Williams or anybody who came into this land to create what became Rhode Island, and the downfall, frankly, of those nations that were here before, how do we reconcile that as we start to build the narrative that gets us to the point where we can start to talk about the Declaration of Independence?
So, and I've warned you about this, right? I'm a 20th century historian, folks. And so this is never something that I would insert myself into in terms of saying I have a full understanding of this period. And that's one of those things where, just like if you go to a trust and estate attorney and you have a question about real estate, they're going to tell you to talk to somebody else. And so we are blessed to have here in Rhode Island experts on these subjects. And I would defer to them in terms of talking about how we gain an understanding of what happens. Now, where Roger Williams comes into this landscape, or even earlier when we're dealing with in terms of when the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth Bay are colonies are established, right? The Narragansett are the largest indigenous nation in this area. But when Roger Williams comes down here, it's also the middle of what is frequently called the Pequot Wars. We then later in the 1670s experience what is commonly known as the King Philip's War, what scholars are now calling the War for New England. And that war in particular, which rages from Connecticut up to what is now Maine, is by the numbers and by percentages, the bloodiest and deadliest war in American soil. It is an absolute catastrophe. And it impacts the towns that are established by the colonists, and it gravely impacts our native nations, and changes forever the dynamics and any semblance of trust that had been developing. And it sets a really tragic stage, but the indigenous population is here. Is still here, still remains. There's never a moment where there are not indigenous persons living and nations that are existing here, whether they are recognized or not by different legal entities. The indigenous voice is always, and the indigenous communities are always part of Rhode Island.
So fundamental, I think, to these discussions. I appreciate. I would say that too oftentimes it's separated into two different discussions. And in fact, it is, as you said, it is enmeshed in a way that is impossible to decouple.
Right. And I just don't feel I can do justice to the complexities of what that means. But that isn't to say that we don't have to grapple with it.
Yeah.
But there's just to say that there are experts in this area who can do a far better job than I.
Let's talk about what. Yeah, we can put out names. My great times a billion grandfather Samuel Gorton.
Oh, goodness.
Down in Warwick.
That's a legacy.
That's a legacy.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Talk about Anne Hutchinson. Great Parkway out in New York. Great role in Rhode Island history. There's all these individuals that basically founded what compiled to become Rhode Island eventually. What was the common thread between all these people?
So it's fabulous to be from a place that has multiple founders, if you will. And for those of you who are listening to this, I'm making bunny quotes. And so we have groups of people who come down and follow particular people, all of whom are in fundamental religious disagreements with those who are in Massachusetts. So frequently the shorthand that we hear, and I wish I had thought about this question I had earlier, that we hear is that, so the Puritans and the Pilgrims came here for religious freedom. They did not. They came here to be able to worship as they so chose without the threat of punishment, right? That's a very different thing than being okay with other people worshiping as they so chose, right? So Roger Williams, and another great myth is that Roger Williams was kind of kicked out of Massachusetts and because he wasn't religious enough. Oh no. You're hard pressed to find somebody who believes more deeply and more thoroughly than Roger Williams does. But he is at fundamental odds, both civically and religiously with what's happening in Massachusetts and Plymouth and the surrounding area. And he tries out all the colonies and all the areas up there. He's in Boston, he's in Salem, he's moving around, but he's just not getting along with people. Now, the other people, many of whom, like Anne Hutchinson, later Mary Dyer, right, they get along with people even less. So they come down and they even have to kind of just move away, Gordon. All right, there's some challenges here. They're very opinionated. And many of them are pretty sure that they know the kind of right way and are setting up communities where they can do that. What makes Roger Williams different in this regard from what we see in Massachusetts, what we see in Plymouth, is when he goes and seeks the parliamentary patent, he wants that only in areas of civil concernment. So what he establishes there through its absence of the mention of religion is a nascent sense of the separation of church and state. What he's interested in is we are setting up this community and here's an agreement within civil concernment. Later, when we get our charter, is where we see the full-throated statement of of toleration and of the separation of church and state. Toleration is not the same thing as celebration. It's also not the same thing as agreement, right? Don't ever read this as he thought all of this was great, or he thought you were just as right as he was. Not at all. He was very committed for himself, but he mandated that you be able to choose for yourself how it is that you worship. And that was even extended to women not having to worship as their husband told them to, which is a famous legal case that happens in Rhode Island. And so he is quite different in that regard, but everyone who comes down and starts to set up the towns that eventually become Rhode Island leaves or is asked to leave, banished, whatnot, because of the fact that they wanted to worship as they so chose. And in Massachusetts and in Plymouth, that wasn't really going to be an option. Even for folks like Blackstone, who are Anglicans, at some point when the colony expands enough, they're like, you know what, you probably should move a little farther away, right? It's not, you don't really believe the same things that we believe. The challenge with Roger Williams is he was also saying, and this really irritated people, that you're basically not religious enough to the Puritans and to the Pilgrims. Like, you're not living up to what the separatism you spoke of. You're still going, when you go over to England, you're worshiping at the same churches, at these Anglican churches. You're not supposed to be doing that. You're kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of kowtowing to what the British or the English are saying you should do. You shouldn't do that. You're separatists. The folks in Massachusetts are afraid that this is going to threaten their existence as a colony. And so they feel that they need to take legal action. Some of the folks who take the legal actions against Williams stay his lifelong friends. And so we need to think about the choices of the 17th century, also thinking deeply about survival in what is a completely unknown terrain to them.
Right. With the aspect also, of course, unknown terrain with unknown woodland creatures, unknown weather, unknown crop.
Exactly. They don't know how to raise the food that they want to raise. So again, they rely upon the native peoples to teach them. We think of it as the Three Sisters, the corn, all of that, but also hunting methods, the seasonality, how to store grain, how to survive in an entirely new landscape and a new climate that is also during a mini ice age. So we also have a very harsh climate and very harsh winters to contend with. And England is just a much milder physical place to be. And also, right, they're coming from towns, right? They're coming from places where they were merchants and now they're farmers, right? Now they're fishing, that they're having to learn how to survive off of the land when they came from places where they were ministers. Elder Brewster comes, carries with him hundreds of volumes of books that he carries with him into what they deem the New World. And so they not only aren't coming from this climate, they're also coming from very different professions and very different urban environments, if you will, and coming into what is for them a frontier
It's so interesting to think about that today as we prioritize comfort in so many ways, right?
This is an uncomfortable place to go.
This is not exactly luxurious. This is driven by one of two things, I would guess: principle and fear. Is that what drove most of the early, obviously, colonizers in general, but specifically to Rhode Island? Is this, I will not waver on my principles, and or I cannot be where I currently am, because if I am, I will not survive?
Well, in many ways, yes. And of course, remembering some of them were banished. So some of that choice is removed. And then it's also, you're banned. You can go back to England, but they will most assuredly imprison you or hang you there. So that's not much of a choice. And so Rhode Island seems okay, and so you might as well take your chances with the unknown rather than the known execution. Or imprisonment. And that's, again, something we really want to stress as we talk about sort of toleration isn't celebration. At the same time, it's also not execution. So it is not imprisonment for what you believe. And that is really what people are experiencing. We can't overstate that enough. This isn't just that folks didn't like people believing different things. This is actually something that people are being imprisoned for, that people are being killed for having different beliefs. And so this is a life and death matter, and it becomes a life and death matter in Massachusetts and Plymouth Bay as well. So they carry with them, by that point, you even have the king in England telling Massachusetts basically to calm down about how many Quakers that they're killing. And so, yes, they're making these choices for survival. They are afraid for their families. So they are motivated certainly by survival and by that fear. And for people like Roger Williams, we also know, and I talk a lot about Roger Williams largely because we have a lot more information about Roger Williams than we have about Anne Hutchinson, for whom, as important as she was, we don't have her writings. We have things her husband wrote about her. So even for a woman of great sort of community power and intellect, we are lacking a lot of those records. So for Williams, he makes it his business when he's in Plymouth in particular, but in Massachusetts and these areas, to develop and trade with indigenous peoples and communities. And so he's already developing a facility with languages of the Wampanoag, of Narragansett, of Nipmuc. And so he's learning how to communicate, and he prioritizes communication. And so this allows him, when he's banished and walking from Massachusetts down to Rhode Island, down to first what is now East Providence and then Providence, it allows him to then communicate and seek safe harbor with people who take him in from the indigenous communities.
Yeah, that is in tandem with just the idea of a bit of an escapist mindset from in terms of the founding of Rhode Island. And in terms of a communication with the indigenous population, are those unique attributes? Are those uniquely Rhode Island when we look at early America?
Yeah. Well, there are certainly different motivations for it. And some people do question Williams' motivation for publishing what's called The Key into the Language of the Americas, which becomes of great importance as a publication published in the 1640s and lasts and is used until the 20th century. But that isn't to say that he is the only European person who is learning the language, learning to communicate, because, right, one of the fundamental things for the religious colonies is proselytizing. So conversion and converting the indigenous community is part of what is being attempted in other colonies as well. So that is what is seen as a driver. And it's also, in certain ways, what motivates England to give those charters. So, right, is the spread of Christianity. And so that is also, you see the Bible being translated, you see what's called praying towns being created. So the intentions behind these things can be different, but they are happening in different ways in different places. But certainly people are striving to communicate just for different purposes. And of course, for trading purposes, that's also survival, economics, all of that.
Fast forward a little bit here, and Rhode Island communicated that they're not happy with the way things are in terms of taxation, in terms of the relationship with the crown through the burning of the Gaspee.
Right.
Rhode Island was out a little bit ahead of the rest of the country when it comes to declaring independence. Again, we're skipping a good chunk of time here.
A lot of the colonial period.
Yeah, exactly. But we're also being mindful of, we spent a lot of time on that, very important fundamental thing. So, but just in terms of that ethos, that stayed true, that sort of outsider, independent thought.
Look, this is embedded in our charter, right? So this kind of independence and this kind of self-governance is embedded in the language in the 1663 charter, which you can see in the Rhode Island State House. If you haven't seen it, it's wonderful. Right. And I mean, you won't be able to read all of it, but still, it's a really fascinating document that also lays out really a lot of self-governance in a way that other colonies don't have. And Rhode Island is really careful with that. Like this is prized for them, right? They do not want to give this up. And so the Gaspee is the most famous, but certainly not even the first time that we go after these revenue disputes, right? Because in many ways, Rhode Island is, as you know, quite small. So there's farming and there's production, but we're never going to compete with this size and scale with like Massachusetts or even Connecticut. And so we turn to the sea pretty early on and we become merchants in for all the ways that's good and bad. And we're able to really become a business center, if you will, an economic engine. And much of that has to do, as argued by historian Bill McLaughlin, has to do with the fact that we don't have an official religion of the colony. Everywhere else, people are tithed. People are taxed to pay for the church. In Rhode Island, that's not happening. And he argues that additional money that they have, that additional capital, is then rolled in to their own businesses. And it allows Rhode Island businesses to grow in a way that doesn't happen in the same way in Connecticut and Massachusetts. It also leads to the rampant speculation that we see in things like the West Indies trade and the Middle Passage and slave trade, right? So we have to grapple with that whole big picture of what this means. But it means that Rhode Island is very concerned with taxation. It's concerned with shipping. It's concerned with cargo and with freight and with people getting onto their ships and with taking money from them, or the perception that we're allowed to do this. We're allowed to make these choices on our own. Why are you interfering with this? Yeah. We've been fine this whole time. Like, why are you suddenly having a problem with this? And so they start pushing back. And the Gaspee is really one of the ways. It's, according to Stephen Park, who's written a really wonderful book about the Gaspee in the last few years, this is a revenue dispute, right? He's not willing to come out, Park is not willing to come out and say, this was self-consciously a revolutionary act. What he says is this is a revenue dispute that turned into a revolutionary act. That it was the next season later when it does a couple of things. One, it compels the creation of the Committee of Correspondence, which is, again, one of the things that helps kickstart this idea of the colonies being united and sharing a kind of a mission and a vision. But it also, it's a minister who preaches a sermon about the Gaspee and says, this is an act of revolution. This is something you should pay attention to. This is an assertion that the crown shouldn't be able to take our money and tell us what to do. In reality, it was about them taking property from Whipple and, in this issue of letting people board. Were they smuggling? Yeah, probably. I mean, they're saying it's nobody else's business. And so this minister is able to print this sermon widely and share this story again. And so this sort of codification and sharing of this information over and over cements this as something that's important. Now, at the time when it also is investigated in a way by the crown that previous actions were not, they can't find anybody who says anybody was there. Like, nobody was there. 50 years after the Gaspee, right, you would have needed about 200 longboats to contain everybody who said that they were there at the burning of the Gaspee, right? But people go, undercover basically, and they say nobody was there. I didn't see anything. Nothing happened. And so they knew that what they were doing was problematic, but they felt that they were kind of protecting their interests, their business interests, and the interests of the colony. It's also what meant that after the Declaration of Independence, even slightly before, 2 days before the Declaration of Independence, New Jersey has its constitution ready to go and ratified, right? Rhode Island says, like, we don't need a state constitution. We got this charter. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. So they just scratch out colony and we go with state. But we use the charter from 1663 as our state constitution until 1842. And that is how, for lack of a better term, that is how in love Rhode Island was with its charter and how expansive the charter was in terms of 17th century thought.
Yeah. And it's such a fundamental, again, using that word a lot, but I think it's so important in history as we have these discussions. What are the fundamental tenets we're building off of? Rhode Island's charter is a unique and central instrument to the state's history and American history. And I wonder sometimes about this. How fragile was this revolution? If the crown said, you know what, let's take a more laissez-faire approach here. Give them what they want, we're good. If other pieces move differently, how close is it that we may not have had the revolution?
I think there was an incredible amount of loyalist sentiment, and the centrist sort of I could go either way is really, really broad. And so there were many people who were not interested in revolution, were not thinking about independence. And so in the years leading up with all of the acts, we all think about all the intolerable acts and all of that. If those, many of which were repealed before they were ever even enacted, if any of those had changed, if they had come out and said, you know what, you're right, just we'll let this keep going. I mean, we have no way of knowing certainly, but yeah, it wasn't largely intolerable to the majority of people. And many people in this period, while they knew they were different from people who lived in England proper, still considered themselves English, governed by them. And this was not such a terrible situation. And so some people have cast it as basically the colony having a tantrum and to the mother country. And so it is certainly, it was by no means a foregone conclusion that this had to happen. It became intolerable to people who had access to power and money, who were in positions of influence and could make a difference. There were tons of people living in the colonies who were unhappy with their day-to-day existence, and rightfully so. But they did not have the same access to the press, to political power, and to financial power.
Are those the voices that are most those powerful press, those with press access, those with an education to write or to be recorded in one way, shape, or form? Are they the primary sources that we use to identify, for historians to use to identify what happened then, or are they in tandem with other major pieces that you're able to build that record from different perspectives?
I think in many ways they are a dominant part of the narrative in terms of what we have of the written record. That is true. So what we have to do is all of us have to look at these records, all of us from different perspectives, with different backgrounds, with different trainings, even in disciplines, have to look at these documents, and we start to see different things in them. And so I think about this not necessarily in terms of, let's say, revolutionary documents, but let's say of business documents. So we have the records of a textile factory. Well, that's wonderful. That tells us the story of this one business. But in reality, if you dig into those records, you start to see the names of all of the people who worked in that factory. You see the names of all of the people who did piecework related to that factory and how much they were doing. Suddenly now you have the voices of the farming community who did seasonal work within factories. You have the voices of women. You have the presence of children. You have the the written record about people of color who are working in the factory system or in this piecework system. So it may not be from the perspective of the woman who is doing that work with, let's say, when cotton came in, frequently they would send the cotton out before we had the cotton gin to remove all of the pieces, the pokey pieces from the cotton. And that could be done in homes by the pound. And so we can learn a lot about the women and the families that are doing this at that time. That's not them telling us, but we do have the record, not just of their existence, but the record of their labor and the record of their relationships, which then allows us to tell a much more complete story about the society in which they're working in. So within within the regular historical record, there are many more stories than we think of. And we need to kind of delve into that. And also what we're finding and what we get to experience is the more access that we have through digitization, frankly, of written records allows scholars to put things in conversation with each other that may not have been before. And so we start to understand, let's say, women in Rhode Island much better just from work being done on women in New Hampshire, giving us clues into what that might mean and suddenly having a much broader sample size to understand these different pieces. So I feel like we want to be thoughtful about saying, oh, well, we'll just never know. I don't believe that. I think there are stories that we have to get at sideways. And we have to be willing to ask different questions, and we have to be willing to do really hard work. And that is the thing that we have to recognize for scholars who do this kind of work, is it's hard, it's a lot of labor, and it takes a long time. And so doing that kind of deep archival work is arduous because it's not as easy as saying, I'm going to look at the papers of Nathaniel Greene. They might be in a lot of repositories, but they've also all been transcribed. There's 13 volumes of them, but they're there and they're at the ready for us to do that work. The other material is not in such ready form. And so we have to think about how we frame and how we ask questions. We have to learn how to interrogate a source in different ways.
Some of the footprints that we have historically here in Rhode Island are in our infrastructure, no doubt. Of course, we look to Pawtucket, the Industrial Revolution, Samuels later, the Blackstone Valley on the whole, the Blackstone River. There's so much there. We could do a full day on that. We probably do an 8-hour podcast on that. We probably ought not ever do that, but it could happen. But there's a lot to look to physically in our environment. When we look around where we are right now, downtown Providence, Newport, of course, even Block Island, there are moments where you stumble upon amazing history. As an historian looking back on 250 years plus a whole lot of time when you study Rhode Island, what do you look for? What gets you excited? What's different that makes you think differently and approach stories from a sideways angle?
Yeah. I mean, I will say in terms of the built environment of Providence, I'm not from here. You know, I grew up and went to school in Philadelphia. And so I grew up immersed in a sort of historic environment. And when I was a junior in college, my aunt and uncle moved to Cape Cod. And they said, why don't you come up, take the train to Providence, and we'll pick you up and bring you out to Cape Cod. And so I did that. And my aunt said, well, you know what? I just want to drive you down this street. I've heard about it, Benefit Street. I just want you to see it. And so when I talk to people about my time, my 30 years now in Rhode Island, I just say that it was just love at first sight with Providence. And a lot of that has to do with the extant historical fabric of this community, the layering of that history from kind of, an 18th century, traces of the 18th century, and whether that is even to look out into the river. I know someday they're going to remove them, but to see the vestiges of the wharves and the docks that are out there off of India Point, to look at the infrastructure of Benefit Street, that is, again, a really troubling gentrification and preservation story of the 20th century, but an incredible story of kind of survival and understanding the 18th century. But then our mills and all of these pieces, and again, the layers of them that we have now turned into so many other things, into homes, into artist studios, into incubator space. And so the ways in which we live with history every day in Rhode Island or whatever communities you come from or go to informs sort of our relationship to it. And so for me, it's kind of continually thrilling to see the ways in which we adaptively reuse the existing built environment in buildings like this and buildings that Johnson & Wales inhabits. It's also interesting to see the interventions made by contemporary architects into these spaces, for good or for ill, as we think about how cities grow. Because what I tell people all the time, people ask, they're like, oh, well, they're building something new. You're a historian. You must hate that. And what historians study is change, right? So we don't always like it. We don't always agree with it, but it's going to be interesting. And it's going to be fascinating and sometimes really bad and sometimes really problematic and sometimes glorious. And so when we look at what we are left with and what remains as we walk through these spaces is to think about all of the hands that touched those spaces. And I think that's what the built environment and material culture did for me and attracted me to history. That was really my avenue in to history. Was because when I saw something, a beautiful chair that was made, what it made me think about wasn't just that's great design, like we would see and study at RISD, but what it made me think about was who is the craftsperson, who is the artisan who made that? Who did they make it for? How did they use that chair? So I think about this wingback chair that we have at the John Brown House Museum. That was a gift from John Brown to his wife when she had their first child as a comfortable chair that she could nurse in, that she could care for her child in, made in Philadelphia and upholstered by a man named Plunkett Fleeson. And so that he made that with such care. But then it makes me think of where does that wood come from that's being used? And so we know that the legs of that chair and the primary pieces are mahogany. And so we get to learn more about mahogany and the troubling history and the troubling present of wood. And the exploitation of workers, of the environment, of everything that goes into that relationship with the West Indies and with Central and South America, and who were the men who were cutting that wood, right? So it lets you go through not just, oh, it's a great chair, but it is an encapsulation of everyone who's touched that chair, from the woman who nursed her child in it, back to the man who cut that wood, and the people who got it aboard the ship and carried it here, who then made it in Philadelphia and then carted it up to Rhode Island. But then how does it get to the Historical Society? Mm. And what is our job to tell that complicated story about a chair, right? So it's the everyday object, the everyday thing that lets us see inside the lives of countless people. And so those aren't necessarily the people who left the written record. Those aren't the people who the books have been written about yet, right? But they're the people who, like all of us in this room, got up in the morning and decided to do something, right? And they all made choices. And sometimes they made a choice to make something beautiful. And that thing is still here 300 years later. And that's amazing to me, right? Like that's a gift to live in a community like this, where not only do we have those pieces, but we have opportunities to be inspired by it, to create art, to create music, to create lives that is informed by the past, but looking continually at the future. That's an incredible gift. Yeah. That makes me excited.
Completely agree. And kind of last area here, as we look to the future, perhaps AI will find a way that we'll still be alive and we'll be doing this again in 250 years. That's totally possible. AI may also...
Very, very exciting.
Yeah. Time machines, they could exist as well. But no matter what, there are lessons that we can look back on from a preservation standpoint, right? And we can say, boy, wouldn't it be great if we could go back and we could have Anne Hutchinson's writings? That'd be great. Right now, it feels like the opposite. We're in a moment where we have just so much inundation of content, and somebody's, high school basketball teammate's brother, who is now weighed against, Ed Fitzpatrick of the Boston Globe, a studied, reputable reporter with the same weight, W-E-I-G-H-T. Historically, how would you be able to tell the difference between my former high school basketball player's brother and his take on COVID and a take from a Boston Globe reporter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of this goes back to things that we have been teaching for a long time and has never been more important through the kind of discernment that we need to show when we look at sources, right? So we're going to have to interrogate each of these sources, and it's going to be challenging. Again, there's so much information right now, and at lunch I used the phrase, if everything's important, then nothing's important, right? How we figure out with now the millions of voices we have at any given moment about something. What we'll need to do is there's going to have to be some aggregating of data, right? So you're going to have to figure out who outliers are. But we're going to hope that this AI or whatever it is at that point in history will allow us to see again who this person is who made these statements. And we have to hope that we continue to value professionalism and expertise in ways that lets us say, okay, I'm able to look at this comment on Instagram by Ed Fitzpatrick, and I'm able to understand who Ed Fitzpatrick is because I'm able to look at his body of work and I'm able to understand where he's coming from. And I'm able to look at this guy who's your cousin's brother's basketball buddy and say like, oh, he seems like an idiot. Like, that's interesting. And we're able to put those things in sort of the classification where they belong. And that's, again, this point of like, when we study history, when anyone who's studying history and doing it again in a kind of professional capacity, they're not usually looking at one comment, right? That's not going to be a thorough analysis of what's going on. I remember there was a well-known book that will remain nameless. And when the gentleman came to Brown to talk about it, he said, well, I've been studying this for 2 years. And I remember one of the historians in the room kind of looked from afar and was like, oh, 2 years. Right. So the amount of time, data, and information that a historian, hopefully, is going to spend understanding what these sources are, putting those in conversation, and understanding what the opinion of sort of an everyman, if you will, is in relationship to how a journalist was thinking about it, which should be viewed differently from how the head of Health and Human Services was thinking about it, which is probably different from how a head of school was thinking about it. And so they're going to look at what it is that they're studying, and they're going to find context. They're going to think about things about the contingency of what's going on, and they're going to try to understand where that source needs to be placed. Sometimes it needs to be placed elsewhere, and it isn't of use to the study as an outlier. Sometimes we can think of it like Olympic scoring, right? Sometimes the really, really laudatory thing and the really, really awful thing cancel each other out. And we have to look, and we're interested in what is the kind of the main feeling and sentiment, but sometimes we're looking for the outliers. So it really depends on what the argument is that the scholar is trying to make and what kind of evidence is going to be necessary for creating that argument, rather than simply trying to tell a narrative of what everyone in the world believed.
We've got a few minutes for Q&A. If anyone has any questions, we've got people with microphones, I believe, roving up and down the aisle. If you want to ask a question, it's your moment.
Hi, my name is Kamara Logan. I'm a hospitality management major. Just a quick question about starting my research on history. I've always been very interested in history, and specifically with me being from Maryland, what was going on with George Washington and right in my area. Where should I start? Where could I start to help me better understand the full circle of it?
Well, I mean, for George Washington, you're very lucky, right? There's a huge amount of information, and it depends on what you're kind of most interested in. So if you're interested in George Washington, kind of the man, right, and the myth, you've got an opportunity to look and start with places like Mount Vernon, which have really changed a lot of their approaches. And there's also libraries that are associated with some of these institutions, and they have incredible resources online. Now, I will say I'm a little biased. I really do feel like online is a great place to start, but if you ever have the chance to actually go and see the things in person, that's always, to me, more fulfilling. As a historian, I work a lot out in like Montana and Wyoming, so I have to rely on things at a distance. But when I get to be out there, it's incredible. But then you can also look in, thankfully for somebody like Washington, the Library of Congress, the National Archives. There's so many places to look. If you're interested in finding out what other people thought about Washington, right? That's another avenue into how people might be writing about him, thinking about him. And there's so many ways that this can happen. And historians can study the most esoteric thing. I saw a great talk on Protestant relics with an entire section on George Washington's teeth. Really amazing. But also George Washington's bones and how they were used in the 19th century at the time of the Civil War to communicate, not the bones themselves, but the messaging around the bones. And so the Library of Congress has things like all of the newspapers digitized, and Maryland has participated in that. So you'd be able to kind of just dig in and jump into those databases. It takes a little while. They're all different. Every repository, every collection has a different database system. And so sometimes it can take a little while to test it out. But going to those sort of trusted sources and then seeing where they might refer you out to. So you go to Mount Vernon, you might not love what they're doing, but there could be a footnote. Footnotes are like my favorite thing in the world. So go to a footnote and you're like, oh, wait, that was at the Maryland Historical Society, or that was at like the Frederick Historical Society. I can go there to that local place because it looks like they did this whole big thing when he came to visit, and I want to study that. And so going to the big places first because they tend to have the most robust infrastructure online, and then seeing where they send you. But never overlooking and discounting the smaller historic organizations that are out there, and certainly not the universities and the college libraries that tend to have really tremendous special collections.
Good afternoon. My name is Marina Kearns, senior hospitality management. So there's a common phrase that says that those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Given that stance, do you see any of the past repeating itself in the present day? And if so, what are you seeing?
Well, I would say I talked about this a little earlier, actually, is that I think, there's another phrase that I tend to resonate with a little more, is that history rarely repeats itself, but it often rhymes. And so, it's again, not thinking about those things that are one-for-one repetitions of what we have seen before, but even in sort of innocuous ways. If we think about this, it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately as I think about the 250th. And that is, the funny thing is, right, we tend to remember the bicentennial 50 years ago as this like love fest, right? Super patriotism. Everybody had a great time. Everything was awesome. The federal government got it like spot on, and every community, one was better than the next, right? And that couldn't be farther from the truth. And so we talked a lot about that. And then 2 weeks ago, a really great article came out in the New Yorker by a historian named Jill Lepore. And she really dug into this idea about how false it is and what a mess the bicentennial celebrations actually were for years. And in reading it, it's, so there's a president that comes in and he decides to he'll let the other thing happen, though they want to dismantle the bicentennial group, but maybe he's going to make his own bicentennial commission and they're going to do their own things. And people are saying, well, he's really doing this for political gain. And, and there's incredible resonances between how we're looking at the 250th right now, and the federal government's 250th positionality and local government's 250th. And so there's an instance where folks are talking today about how challenging it is and how challenging the time is right now and how they're looking back wistfully at 50 years ago, when in reality, it is in many ways verbatim what people were saying 50 years ago. And so it's really interesting that even when people were self-consciously trying to do what they did 50 years ago, i.e. make it great, they're doing what they did 50 years ago, and it's very challenging.
It's interesting. Part of my work is I am on the radio in the afternoon, not this afternoon, but most afternoons, and people call in or whatever, and that's a discussion we had. People would say, wow, you wouldn't believe the patriotism in, the night we would go out to Newport during, 3 or 4 days. People were given days off from work, and they paint this picture as if it literally was everything shut down for the celebration of America. And I don't know, but I think you're accurate. I think what you're reporting there, I also read that article, it seems to be more likely. And I think that's maybe what we're repeating, but perhaps in the opposite way right now, where there is no doubt a gloomy, at best, atmosphere. And I think it's becoming a difficult question for a lot of people it's an unfortunate timing for the 250 to land at this moment where we are really able to ask an honest question right now. Are we going to have a 300th celebration of not only this country, but will this world exist? And that's a real question that we haven't probably ever addressed yet.
Well, at the 200th, they asked, people questioned whether or not we'd have a 250th. So. And
people thought, do you know the sentiment of that? That'd be such an interesting data dive. Attitude of participants in patriotic events, right? Or the number of people that right now are saying, yes, I want to celebrate my country at this moment. Because no doubt, pollable data shows that it is at an all-time low. And I think that this could be a warning for future generations to say, hey, wait a minute. We need to have some kind of, just like when we evaluate history, we need a national compact, something we can grab onto and say, okay, this is it. We're safe here together. And we simply lack that right now. So to me, it seems unprecedented and perhaps a warning to if we make it. I think that's a real question, if we make it to 300.
Not sure that answers your question fully, or it's quite a happy note, but yeah. But I do think that, I mean, one of the things that we do know from study and data in the late 20th and early 21st century is that as we removed the study of history in particular, study of civics, but the study of history in particular, we see incredible decreases in the amount of voting that goes on and civic engagement in general. So it's not just, I mean, civics is fundamentally important as well. But again, the study of history. And I think that study of history, whether it's American history, world history, it demands certain things of its students, i.e. learning judgment. How do we look at sources? How do we look at trusted sources? How do we understand and put things in a broader perspective and a broader context and understand the role of individual actors? It gives that kind of bigger picture. And so in a most basic way, I believe that when we take away history education, we do erode our ability to make sound judgments, to make good decisions that are based in understanding that all of our actions on any day have implications that are far greater than ourselves. And so whether or not we repeat or rhyme, the fact of the matter is we're making poor decisions if we don't understand what people did before and the consequences of those things.
Yeah.
Another question here. We have time for one more question.
My name's Jalen. I'm a food and beverage entrepreneurship major. I was just wondering, in anything that you've studied, there's the theory of the butterfly effect. Is there anything that you've researched and you've really seen this theory appear at all?
So that basically if there's one little kind of change, or let's say, as Bill was talking about earlier, if one thing didn't happen, would there be a kind of cascading effect? Yeah. Goodness. I mean, I think that, there's so many, right? If we think about history in this way of being a series of decisions, right? Every day is the worst day and the best day for somebody. And I think about that all the time when we think about kind of predictions of the end of the world. And it's well, it was for someone. And so, but yes, let's say if we've been talking about Roger Williams so much, when he decides to get on that ship, when he decides to get on the Lion and he decides to come to the United States and he makes that choice not to accept a teaching position because he's in disagreement, right? He makes a choice then to become a farmer. And when he's farming, he starts trading, he starts learning these languages. And when he learns those languages, he builds relationships with the indigenous population that save his life as he's banished by his fellow Englishmen. And so again, in one of those instances, at every step, that one choice to kind of get on that ship and accept that teaching position is why we're here in this room. You could extrapolate that to any number of persons or decisions that are as small as the people who become our parents and them meeting, to again as big as again that man making that choice, or even as a 7-year-old to learn Dutch because his neighbors spoke Dutch and he wanted to speak to them, and he lived down the street from Newgate Prison and he saw people tortured for what they believed. Those actions, every little moment, fed into kind of who he was and the choice that he made and made these things possible. And I don't take that as a lesson that, great people make choices and do great things, but rather what decisions and what's within our control that we do every day that we have no idea. I don't think that Roger Williams could imagine the room that we're sitting in and the technology that we're using and who all of you are and where you come from sitting in this room. That doesn't matter. He made that choice and he did those things, and we're all here. And so I think for me, the study of history is a lesson in the importance of choices. We all have, and every historical actor had a circumscribed life, and they had choices they could make and other choices were not afforded to them. We hear that all the time when people study history and they say, you know what I would have done? And then they say something that would have in no way been a possibility for them to do. So we all have different choices that are in front of us, but they're choices nonetheless. And we don't know what the outcome of that choice will be. And that's on the one hand kind of scary, and on the other hand, really empowering to understand that we all make a difference and an impact in some way in that world through every choice that we make. And that's a lot of responsibility. But it also has just unimaginable potential.
C. Morgan Grefe, Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historic Society, joining me at Johnson & Wales University for a live podcast. You can find images from that on my Instagram at Bill Bartholomew. This is Bartholomewtown. We'll talk to you next time.